I'm joined by our regular guest, Professor Salim Mansur of Western University, to discuss a Canada First policy with regards to our current situation with the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. Good day, Salim. How are you?
Morning. I'm very well. Thank you very much.
I've prepared a few notes, Salim, just to get across what I think might be a good place to jump off from in a historical context about Canada's foreign policy. After that, I'd like to have your input on that, if you would be so kind.
Okay.
Okay, so just give me a moment here, and I'll read this. I just penned it because these are my thoughts on the whole problem, and it's such as conflicting, almost like an abortion issue of just dividing people apart in this country. So I had to write it down just to make sure that I had it right. To date, Canada's foreign policy with regards to war has always been as a follower of Mother Britain, a follower of the United States, and a follower of the United Nations. With rare exceptions, and those being the war in Vietnam and the Iraq War after 9/11, Canada acts as a lapdog to larger nations and multinational organizations who either do not share the same values as Canadians, and the United Nations would fit this category, or the national interests of one nation do not align with the national interests of Canada. Ottawa's current attitude toward the conflict in the Ukraine is no different than its involvement in all other conflicts, with one notable exception. While in other wars and conflicts, Canada professed a reluctancy to throw itself into the fray or expressed a desire for a negotiated peace, the Russo-Ukrainian conflict has brought out a belligerent jingoism from Canada I'd never seen the like, and it's from our current gang of rulers. The language coming from Ottawa is not one of reluctancy to go to war, nor a call for discussion and negotiation. It's a saber-rattling language of rabid dogs just itching to join the fight against Russia. If Ottawa was not in the company of warmongers like Brussels or Biden's Washington or Johnson's London, then Trudeau Singh's talk would be like a blustering chihuahua yapping at a bear. It's quite comical. In my estimation, there are three conditions to be met before a free nation, quasi-free nation, engages in war. Number one, their military must be made up of volunteers. Number two, we must have the moral high ground. In other words, a freer nation has every right, morally, to invade a dictatorship. But number three, it must be in the national interests of the nation. Canada meets the first two conditions, although given recent action by Trudeau Singh's government, I would say only barely are we a freer nation. The third condition is not met, in my estimation. There is no reason, as a matter of national interest, to risk Canada going to war with Russia. And that's what would happen if we crossed over into the Ukraine with weapons or military, or even the funding of the Ukrainian military could be seen by Russia as a hostile act of war. There's no strategic importance of Ukraine to Canada, and there's no Canadian military ally under threat currently from Russia. And I have to remind people that Ukraine is not an ally militarily of Canada. It is not part of NATO. Any war we have with Russia will most certainly be destructive to Canada's infrastructure, its treasury, and its people's lives. We've no business involving ourselves in this conflict, and I think that the belligerent, jingoistic, saber-rattling talk coming from Singh and Trudeau and all the rest of them, the Western leaders, mostly from the Anglosphere in Europe, very little from the rest of the world, it just has to stop. What are your thoughts, Salim?
Well, most of what you have expressed are very pertinent, very relevant, and that's what we are here to discuss. In the broader sense, you are asking the question, do we, Canada, have a foreign policy doctrine, or have we ever had a foreign policy doctrine that we have tried to stick to and follow? you have laid out that the practice rather than a foreign policy doctrine, which would mean that there's a consensus in the Canadian public and the Canadian population, and that the input of the public is taken seriously just as much as the public is taken seriously by the ruling class to get them into that consensus and that understanding that this is Canada's foreign policy historically. I can lay out a number of pointers on this in this issue, and I will do so by taking our mother country, that is Britain, and its foreign policy doctrine, and then of course the United States as our principal ally, or we in effect have become a principal vassal state of the United States, and that too I would like to elaborate. You also pointed out that in the past we have followed Britain, which is the mother country that I'm talking about, and then subsequently we have followed the United States in going into any conflict situation. I mean, a foreign policy ultimately is about war and peace issue. That's the very foundation of the UN Charter, the opening preamble. The UN is charged with trying to maintain peace in a world in which two horrendous world wars were fought, one ending in a nuclear bomb, the atom bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So the question then emerges, and you have, in a sense, laid it down, and that becomes now very critical in the context of what is happening in Ukraine, which in effect, as we know from public records and statement made by the Biden administration, President Biden, his Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, his Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, that this is a war in Ukraine, which in effect is a proxy war of NATO against Russia. And in no uncertain term, President Biden in Warsaw, only about 6 weeks ago, or 8 weeks ago, the beginning of March, when he went to Warsaw after a NATO conference, basically said, Putin cannot stay. Oh my God, Putin has to go. In other words, it's a regime change. And only about 4-5 weeks ago, Lloyd Austin said that America's policy in Ukraine is, and let me quote him, he said, we want to see Russia weakened to the degree that it can't do things that it has done in invading Ukraine. If you parse those words, this whole idea that NATO was a defense alliance when it was founded in 1949 and Canada joined it in 1949, that after the end of the Cold War, which was the basis, the reason, the pretext of the establishment of NATO, that after the end of the Cold War in 1991, NATO has gradually become not a defensive alliance, but actually, an offensive platform for the member state to engage in pushing an agenda, which now we can identify clearly as a globalist agenda, the liberal rule-based order that is going to be dictated by NATO, which principally means the United States, and the rest of the world has to follow. Rule-based order as opposed to international law in terms of the United Nations Charter, which every member state in the world has signed on to become a member. But at its foundation, there was something like 40 plus states, and one of them was the Soviet Union. And the rule and the United Nations Charter, when you examine it, is very clear that it was about a multipolar world, that the actual power on the question of war and peace resided not in the United Nations membership at large, but it resided with the Security Council, and within the Security Council, the 5 permanent veto members. In other words, not only the victors of World War II, United States, Soviet Union, Britain, France, and at that time, Republic of China, but also a recognition that the world is multipolar. This is in 1944-45, with the architects of the United Nations. Canada was a player in that, in designing it. And so the 5 permanent members represents the multipolarity of the world. It is not one world government in that sense of the term, or the main issue. And the veto that was given to the 5 permanent members is about those 5 permanent members defending their spheres of influence and their national interests, so that anything that goes into a threat or a conflict or a possibility of a war between any of the 5 member states, the Security Council, the permanent member, the veto member can veto any of that Security Council resolution, leading to eventually a war. Okay, so that is the context, that is the framework of international policy that was established in 1945. We, in the last 20, 25 years, have been listening to and hearing the dictates of liberal rule-based order. Well, if there can be a liberal rule-based order, Robert, then there can be a Roman Catholic rule-based order. There was a Holy Roman Empire. There can be a Sharia-based international order. There was the Ottoman Empire. Islamism, or the Islamists, they want to recreate the Sharia-based rule order, and impose it within their sphere of influence or take it to the rest of the world, So this rule-based order is actually an ideological construct of the liberals, the progressivists in the United States of America. And their major spokesmen, or the people who are pushing this hard, beginning, and we have all the documents now, beginning with the 1991 end of the Cold War and the project for the new American century that was advanced by the neocons in America, and they are the ones who are pushing this globalist world order. So that is the larger picture. So the relevant question is, what is Canada's foreign policy? When or anyone can do this, go into the website of, now it is called the Global Affairs, Ministry of Global Affairs. It used to be the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. So you go in there. I downloaded it, 2-page of statement, and then it's all subdivided into the issues. The headline is Raison d'etre, Mandate and Role, Who We Are and What We Do. This is the Justin Trudeau government. So for the last 7 years, since 2015, it is all about Canada's role as a member of the United Nations, as a member of NATO. It is all about multilateralism in the context of living up to, participating in it, and providing Canada's support in terms of financial assistance and, when and if required, military assistance, all through the United Nations and through NATO. These are the 2 alliances that we speak about. Well, you hit the nail on his head. We haven't heard of any UN Security Council resolution that was passed on Ukraine. The one motion that was tabled on Ukraine soon after the February 24th special military operation that began in the Donbass region, that was vetoed by Russia. So there is no UN Security Council resolution on Ukraine. There was a motion in the UN General Assembly on condemning Russia's military operation, quote unquote, invasion of Ukraine. And there was a split that emerged, a split in which there was a whole number of countries didn't want to take a position. That means they wanted to be neutral or non-aligned. And so there was something like, half, almost 50 countries that abstained. There were some countries that opposed the motion. And then there were those countries who are politically and economically dependent upon Western powers, particularly the United States and the G7 countries. They supported the motion, but the UN General Assembly motion does not carry any weight on the issue of war and peace. So there you have it. There is no UN Security Council motion. And then NATO. This is the proxy war of NATO, and NATO has been moving on this, NATO and the European Union. Well, NATO as an organization has not invoked Article 5 of NATO that calls for a collective action if any one member of NATO has been aggressed upon or invaded. Well, two things immediately arise. There is no Article 5 invocation that has taken place. And moreover, the talk about Ukraine joining NATO, expedited membership into NATO, whether Ukraine should, Kiev should make the application under what consideration and so on and so forth, the discussion that was basically escalating from about December of 2021 till the February 24 operation that Putin launched in Ukraine, were all discussion. They were all an escalation of rhetoric about what we in the West, those of us have been following it, have been very concerned about, the incremental and then accelerated expansion of NATO eastward towards the frontiers of former Soviet Union, Russia, from the end of 1991, when guarantees were made by the then leaders in the Western world, including President George Herbert Walker Bush, 41, and the French president, the German chancellor, the British prime minister, that NATO would not expand eastward beyond Germany, taking in the Warsaw Pact countries, was the concern that had begun to happen since about the end of 1990s, and then started accelerating, and so on and so forth. So back to NATO, there has been no declaration of anything. And yet here we are, 10 weeks into the war that has been escalating, both at the military level and at the term in terms of the financial contributions that Ukraine has been demanding, and the Americans and others are providing or laundering, whichever may be the view that we take, through Ukraine, the latest being $40 billion that Americans have voted for Ukraine as an aid package. And many more $1 billion are in the pipeline through other NATO countries, to which can be added the Canadian contribution. And I believe if we add up the numbers, we are already in this period of 10 weeks, according to the figures from the Global Affairs Ministry and the Canadian Ministry of Defense, is rapidly closing into Canadian $2 billion. And the question, therefore, we are asking, on behalf of people, Canadians, to the extent that Canadians are informed about it or care about it, is where has there been the discussion about all of this matter in the Parliament? Have they discussed it? Have they moved a motion about it? Have they tabled resolutions about this, and then defined it not simply in terms of humanitarian assistance or in terms of NATO, because that would immediately raise the question if there are members in the parliament who are willing to ask that question, and that goes into the structure of our Canadian Parliament at this present time, where we are basically a coalition government in which Justin Trudeau is acting as the majority party, and therefore the mandate that he has taken after the 2021 election, bringing in Jagmeet Singh and the NDP into partnership, that this is a majority government and they'll run it right through the mandate of minimum 4 years. And so how about the Conservative? Are they asking a germane question? And what we have seen so far is that everybody has a pin on of the Ukrainian flag. Everybody is on board, and so it is left to the Canadian people to ask, because the media is not asking the question. The narrative is on. Putin is the bad guy. He is the Hitler. He is the monster. Ukraine is a small country that has been invaded. Its sovereignty and its independence is under attack by a nuclear power country, and the rest of the world must clamber on board to push back Russia, to defend Ukraine, and so on and so forth. All sorts of questions can be asked. Why have we run headlong into Ukraine when according to the Prime Minister, we are defending in Ukraine freedom and independence, was exactly what was being denied to the Canadian people only a few months ago? How do we square all of that? So that's on the historical side, but on the fundamental side, what is the basis of Canadian foreign policy?
Yeah, that's why I was suggesting that under that second condition I mentioned, that the freer nations have every right to invade a dictatorship. We have a moral right to invade communist China today if we so chose. Of course, that is not in our national best interest, and we would not do that. We would be crushed. So I would never thought myself growing up that I would ever take a side opposed to Europe or the Anglosphere or NATO and question our involvement in a proxy war with Russia. I never thought that. I always thought that we were on the good side. But the events of the last 2 years, the quashing of all of our rights, all of our individual rights, which today are still quashed. I can't move. Millions of Canadians can't get on a plane, train, or boat because of a medical decision they chose. And that is a complete violation of our individual rights. So I have no allegiance to this government. I have no allegiance to NATO. I have no allegiance to the Anglosphere or Europe, as long as we continue to act as an authoritarian dictatorship, which we are. So can you talk for a bit, Salim, because you gave me a map. Can you talk a bit about that map where it shows those nations which are belligerent against Russia and those nations which are indifferent or supporting Russia in this particular Russo-Ukraine conflict? Can you talk a bit about that map?
Yeah, I would like to do that. I mean, you have raised, I think, two very important points in the remarks. One is that you have no allegiance, that this war does not represent in any way what you would support it. So you're speaking as an individual. You have a right to speak as an individual. You have a right to take a stand, either as a pacifist. There have been a long history of pacifists in Canada.
I'm not a pacifist.
No, you are not, but an individual has a right to take a position as a pacifist, and that is a fundamental right of an individual. What then is the consequence that individual will face is then left to the government in power and so on, and whether there are protections. It's like the freedom of speech issue, So that is on one side of the equation, and that might take us in a different direction of conversation. The other one is about this map that shows the emerging rupture, which I'm calling rupture or split in the world. We are about 193 sovereign nation state. Technically, I'm not talking about failed state, rogue state. I mean, these are nation states that are recognized by the UN and they sit in the UN, you know, from small states like Luxembourg to massive continental states like Russia and China and Canada and in the United States. So what the map shows is a clear division between what I might call the Anglo-American sphere, North America, that is Canada, the US, up to the Rio Grande boundary of United States with Mexico. And then below that is from Rio Grande, Mexico, all the way to Terra del Fuego, the bottom tip of South America or Latin America, that whole continent, in addition to the whole continent of Africa, North Africa, the Middle East, and then the whole Asian continent on the other side of the equation. And then you have Australia, New Zealand, allied with what is the Anglosphere, Canada, United States, Britain, and then the European or EU member states. So this is the division that has arisen. That is 80% or thereabouts of the world population is basically neutral or on the other side, according to the votes that have taken place in the UN, both at the Security Council, which did not pass because Russia vetoed it. China abstained. China didn't support it. India was in the Security Council as a non-permanent member. India abstained, did not support the motion. So you have this emerging reality in the world, a reality in which you might say the global South and the non-Anglo-American sphere stands on one side of the division that does not see this war in Ukraine as a war that has been defined by the Americans and the Europeans, including Justin Trudeau. And they see that there is a legitimacy, even if it might be questioned in terms of political discussion and political understanding of the situation, say for in the case of India, questioning it or discussing it, or Pakistan, or in the Middle East, countries like Saudi Arabia that has been, a principal ally of the United States, and now the Saudi government refuses to take a phone call from the Biden administration, and so on and so forth. This is a very, very interesting and a pivotal moment, I believe, we are seeing in history. How this will play out in the long term is open to, discussion and speculation. But the fact of the matter is that almost 80% of the world, and particularly the emerging regional powers. China, of course, is a global power, the world's second largest economy. It's very rapidly becoming, a principal, a major military power. It is now the basis of the supply chain and so on and so forth. So China is there in opposition to, or now in alliance with Russia, that has come together, Russia, China. There's the whole Eurasian map of the world. Then you have India, another country, with over or close to 1.4, 1.5 billion people. So China and India together constitute over 1/3 of the world population, and they're the two rising powers. Then you have Brazil in South America. Then you have countries like South Africa and Nigeria and Egypt, and the oil-producing countries of the Middle East, the Gulf states. They are now wavering. They are now calculating. Can we go along with the American leadership, the Anglo-American leadership as they've gone to, they're open now to building relationship with Russia, or in this particular instance, being neutral on the question of war. The only Asian country that is allied to the Anglo-American sphere is Japan, but the question remains, how long for? Japan has its own interest, and Japan is the third or the fourth economic power in the world, though it is not a military power. But countries like Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, all of these countries are in the global South bloc. So what we are saying, if you want to draw a historical analogy, is the rise or the emergence of something similar to the non-aligned movement. That is, the non-aligned with the Western powers on some of the very critical questions, may not be aligned with Russia or China, but being non-aligned, being flexible, that they will take sides and they will make choices according to their political doctrine, their national security doctrine. So you bring me back to, again, that fundamental question: what is Canada's foreign policy doctrine? And in your opening remark, I think you put it in a way that I was, in my mind, looking at it and contextualizing it. That is, that we have been under the thumb of, willingly or unwillingly, that is another debate, but we have been under the umbrella, if not thumb, the umbrella of protection and security and guidance and leadership of Britain, the mother country. In one phase of our history, you might say that phase of the history was 1867 till the end of World War II, 1945, but 1867 and before 1867, going all the way back to the War of 1759, when British North America was established. So we are the colony, and so we have followed the mother country, and we have had no independent position on any of the issue in this long period. In other words, on the main issue of war and peace, Canada has marched to the order of the requirement of the mother country. The first major conflict that took us out of our, this homeland protected by two oceans was the Boer War, 1899-1902 in South Africa. That eventually led to the formation of the Republic of South Africa, But that Boer War, or war with the Afrikaners, I mean, your remark about this situation in Ukraine, that, you have nothing to do with this war, you will oppose it on principle and so on and so forth. Those you said, if you transport yourself back to the 1899, 1902, you would possibly be making the same statement, and there would be very many others making the same statement as those French Canadians did, in Quebec did, What has it got to do with us? But Canada went to war. Canada supplied arms and equipment. We here in London, where you used to reside, we have our war memorial with the Boer War insignia on it, So we went to war. But the major war test came in World War I. Again, we went across the ocean. We sent almost 500,000 men. We look back upon it with, tremendous pride and glory, but asking the fundamental question about Canadian foreign policy, whether it was Prime Minister Robert Borden in World War I or whether it was Prime Minister Mackenzie in World War II, the moment the guns started firing in August of 1914 or September of 1939, we were there. We were there in World War I with almost 500,000 men. We were there in World War II with almost 1 million men. In a population, in World War I, we were a population barely 5 million people, around about 6 million or so. In World War II, in 1939, 1945, when we conscripted about 1 million men into the armed forces and became the third largest army in the world, our population was about 11 million people. So 1 in 11 people, 1 in 11 Canadians, took to the uniform and went to war, But here comes the other point. We went to those two wars, including the Boer War, as Canadians, but we also exposed to the world, including ourselves, or first to ourselves and then to the world, that we are a divided country. The first War Measures Act and conscription crisis came in World War I. The French refused to participate in that war, and the division grew from there. And the same thing was repeated in World War II. This prime minister's father was a young man. Well, young men of his age group were all, taking to uniform. He was taking to his leather jacket and whatever, motorbike to roam around Montreal. So there we are. We are a divided country, and we have not been, in that sense, clearly with a statement of what is, on this fundamental issue, what is our doctrine? What is our interest? Well, one thing is our geographical reality, Bob, right? So long
We're a buffer
those
state.
two oceans.
We lay right between Russia, former Soviet Union, and the United States. We're a buffer state.
Well, that's what I'm
Great
saying.
powers.
Exactly. But for long before that situation, that is long before the first bomb was dropped, the Manhattan Project came around with it. That issue was not on the table. So the two oceans protected us. We were secure. Same was with America. The last war that the British fought through Canada was the War of 1812, with John Madison being the American president in 1812. And it was a spillover of the war, with American trying to expand further along the Great Lake coast, running into conflict with the native population around the Great Lake coast, which came into the support of the British, and so on and so forth. And Britain went all the way down to Washington and burned the White House.
Well, they burned the president's residency. It only became the White House after they whitewashed the burns away.
Yeah, true. It was after that burning down. But the point is that was the last occasion that we have the longest undefended frontier in the world with the United States. We have the two oceans, and we are in that sense one of the most privileged countries in the world, that we don't want to think about what other countries, whether it is, Ukraine now, whether it is, the people in the Middle East, Israel, Palestinians, Syrians, and Iraqis, or India, Pakistan. India, Pakistan are both nuclear power countries with their friction and the wars that they have fought over Kashmir, and if there is another war, it could very rapidly go to the nuclear level. So we have not been faced with all of this problem. But after 1945, things change. After 1945, and yet this is not part of our discussion. I bet if you go around, Robert, and ask people in your part of the country, or if I ask them in London, and if talk about it, I don't think 1 out of 10 people will know or understand or have given it a thought. That how is it that we are not sensitive to the reality of Moscow and whoever is Moscow's leader in terms of their frontiers and the threats that they face, as we are situated in a similar situation between Russia, former Soviet Union, and America. And that crisis came home into Canadian politics. And I think people have forgotten that. Our leaders have forgotten that. Our teachers and educators have forgotten that. And our media, of course, is a proper propaganda arm of the elite, and they won't talk about it. We became without any effort on our part or taking any position on our part, simply by the fact of the geographical situation. Once the world entered the nuclear age with intercontinental missile, when the Soviet Union launched the Sputnik in the air in 1958, in 1949, NATO was signed and Canada joined it. But that was a situation on the European continent with Europe divided. On one side, the Warsaw Pact countries led by the Soviet army. On the other side, the Allied forces, Britain, France, and the United States, which was rapidly converted into NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
By the way, Salim, let me stop you there. By the way, I mean, I fully support that. At that time, that was a necessary thing. The Soviet Union was an existential threat to the security of the world. And it had designs on expansionism and imperialism in this communist sense. So NATO's beginning, its birth, was quite legitimate. And I supported it fully. You know, I was in the Canadian military. I was training, you know, with the threat of something happening with the Soviet Union. We were doing exercises geared to being flown over to Norway to defend Norway, even though we knew that the war would probably be over in a couple of weeks with two nuclear powers going together. So NATO as a concept is valid up to the point of 1991 and the fall of the Soviet Union. After that, there was no discussion about its validity anymore as a North Atlantic Treaty Organization. All they thought about was, oh, quick, let's gobble up those Western or those Eastern former Warsaw Pact countries in case the Soviet Union, which was now dissolved by its own weight, attempts to threaten Poland again, or Lithuania, or Estonia, or, you know, it didn't make any sense in that context. So I don't want to come across as being pro-Russian or anti-Canadian or anti-NATO. I think that we have to learn to put things into context and to discuss things as they are happening on the ground, and whether or not we need a foreign policy that reflects Canada's interests as a relatively peaceful nation in the world.
Absolutely. But you see, that's where nation states, a nation state that become, due to economics, technology, science, and so on and so forth, and of course, natural resources, more than a nation state, they become regional powers, right? Canada is not in that sense a regional power, though we might pretend to be one, and that's why some people want to make Canada a regional power. But we talked about Canada, that is, the people talked about Canada, Lester Pearson and others, as a middle power, as a do-good player, you know, as a bridge builder of some sort. But we are a middle power. We are not a regional power, you know, that United States is the superpower. But United States became a superpower after World War II, in the sense, you know, nuclear power, military power, of course, resources, its economy expanded, and so on and so forth. So powers, that is, nation state that are powers, and even a middle power like ours, at which what we defined ourselves in the middle half of the 20th century after World War II, they have to lay out a statement, a conceptual statement, a doctrine of what it is that they stand for and they defend. Because the United States, as a superpower after 1945, turned its back upon the history of the United States.
Yes, it did.
Prior to World War II, prior to World War I. That is the debate that we are back to again in America. You know, we began with the election of President Trump in 2016. America first. Your opening remarks was Canada first. What does America first mean? What would Canada first mean? It would mean, if it has any credibility, it would mean that this is the way we see our national security interests, and this is the way we define a foreign policy position in the world. So we would then be laying down, in some ways, red lines for our own security, that if you cross this line, if you do such and such thing, then you are aggressing upon our national interest, and we will have every right to defend it. Well, one is a very clear red line for any country, that you cross their internet, their frontier, and so that's an invasion, but every invasion, you might say, or people might say, historically looking at it, is not an invasion. It is part of the war that erupts, for other reasons, and so on and so forth. So there was, and there is, a necessity to define our national security position, doctrine. And that changed because until 1945, as we have just exploded, just in a thumbnail sketch, we followed the mother country. Whatever the mother country's national security interest was, we responded to that with our resources, both in terms of blood and treasure. But what was our mother country's national interest? It has been written about extensively, but let me just quote to you, paraphrase them, because I'm recalling from my memory, of the two great prime ministers of England. One from the middle of the 19th century, Lord Palmerston, who served, who was the prime minister under Queen Victoria. And the gist of the long speech that on this particular occasion that Palmerston made in the House of Commons, in the multiplicity of wars that of Britain has fought. So in the middle of the 19th century, after the Napoleonic Wars, the gist of his speech was that nations have no permanent and eternal enemies or permanent and eternal friends. Nations have permanent interests. Okay, and so that interest can change from time to time, but in the generic sense that there are those interests, and a nation state, in this case Britain, a power, will go to war. That was about a century later, or less than a century later, before World War II. Again, Churchill, who was then not a prime minister, he was in his wilderness years, but he was a front bench member of the Conservative Party, the Tories. He pointed out that Britain, for centuries, has had one clear policy, and that policy was to take the side of the weaker power in Europe against the stronger power in Europe. In other words, Britain has always moved to war whenever it has seen that one power might come to dominate Europe. So Britain is the balance of power holder. Britain fought against Spain, made alliance with France during the time of Elizabeth I and after, the Spanish Armada and so on and so forth. Britain fought against, that was Spain, Britain fought against France, the Napoleonic War, by making alliance with Prussia, Germany. Then Britain made alliance with France against Germany, and so on and so forth. So the national security doctrine of Britain, as Churchill defined it, has always been in the sense of Britain is a part of Europe, but Britain is not of Europe. Britain is an island, and it holds a balance, and it will always move. And so that's the Anglo-American alliance of Britain, So in 1945, the war ends. Britain is no longer, the British Empire is going to very rapidly, come to an end, the empire, and it is the rise of America. America becomes the global power, and there is a shift, but the shift does not register in the minds of our political leaders, particularly with the Conservative Party, with John Diefenbaker, and this crisis was played out because with the rise of nuclear weapons, making of and the coming of the intercontinental ballistic missile, Canada was in the middle of whatever would be the flight pattern of these missiles between the United States and Soviet Union. And so after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, Diefenbaker was under the pressure to decide. Britain, he had scrapped the Avro Air jet that the Canadians had put together, which was supposed to be the finest jet plane in the world at that time, but there was no buyers for it.
That picture right there is of the Avro Arrow.
Okay. So it's a beautiful picture, plane from the time that it was made in the mid-1950s, and it had no aircraft that was anywhere close to its performance in avionics and speed and so on. But Canada could not sell it because the Americans were not going to buy it. They had their own industry, and that's another tragic story of Canada. But we're not going to get into it. But Diefenbaker scrapped that, and in turn he bought the Bomarc missile that could be fitted with conventional weapons and with nuclear warheads. But after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the JFK administration wanted or pressured the Diefenbaker government to make the decision of fitting the Bomarc missiles with nuclear warheads, and the cabinet split. The foreign minister, or the Secretary of State for External Affairs at that time, Howard Green, opposed it because it became the question of sovereignty. A nuclear warhead fitted on the Bomarc missile would be done by the Americans. The command and control would go under to the Americans, and the question became, what about Canadian sovereignty? Though in 1958, Canada and the United States, again under the Diefenbaker government with President Eisenhower as the president, we had gone into the making of NORAD, North American Aerospace Defense Command. And this thing came back after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Kennedy administration wanted the Bomarcs to be armed with nuclear warhead. Howard Green said no. The foreign minister, the defense minister, Douglas Harkness, said yes. Diefenbaker could not decide the issue. The matter spilled over into the public domain. The American pressure was there. The media picked it up. April of 1963, the election, and Diefenbaker government was defeated by Lester Pearson, who went on under the Pearson to accept the Kennedy administration and the subsequent Johnson administration demands about equipping the Bomarc missiles, till eventually the Bomarc missile was scrapped. The point is, with a crisis that is no longer in the memory of Canadian people, nor its political ruling class, Canada, as a buffer state, had to meet the demands of its ally. If Canada did not meet it, we don't know what would be the results. But can you imagine, can any Canadian imagine the Canadian territory being used by a hostile power to America for their own defense needs or their own? That's not about to happen. The Americans would rapidly move in. So we would then have a replay of 1812, where instead of the British going down to Washington, it would be the American going into Ottawa. So we went from under the British umbrella into the American umbrella, NATO and NORAD. And in fact, we have...
I'm sorry, could it be that we do have a foreign policy with regards to war, and that has been explicitly outlined, as you've shown with the Foreign Affairs, Global Affairs Office, there's statement that our national interests are whatever the United Nations says that they are. And I'm taking that the map that you gave of those nations who are actively involved in the Ukraine conflict and on the side of Ukraine matches almost to a state or a nation the object of the globalist agenda, Agenda 21, Agenda 2030, that we've talked about before, where you have mass migration from the global south to the global north and from the global east to the global west. those nations you've shown that are on the side of Ukraine, also happen to be the brunt of the globalist agenda and the nation states that are committing suicide by pushing the globalist agenda. So could it be said that Canada's national interests don't exist outside of the interests of globalism?
Canada's national interests exist outside of the interests of globalism?
Yes, we don't have any national interests because, as Trudeau says, we are not a nation state. We have no culture. We are not a nation. He is a global citizen. So we have no national interests under Trudeau Singh. We have United Nations interests.
Absolutely. That has become more and more clarified. We have been living in a haze, in a fog. That is, we went from the British umbrella. We made the transition after 1945 to the crisis of the Bomarc Missile crisis, Cuban crisis, etc., where the people made a decision. That is the election. If election is counted as a decision making on the part of the people, that there was some discussion, there was some media discussion, and Diefenbaker who had won two massive majority governments rapidly, fell apart after this crisis, where the foreign minister and the defense minister, they split the cabinet, and Diefenbaker could not handle it, and it rapidly lost ground. And when the election came, it was defeated, and the Conservative never came back except for that brief period in 1979 under Joe Clark. Right? We have had Liberals, and then we have a brief period with Mulroney. We can go back and define that, whether Mulroney was a Conservative or not. I would say Mulroney was a Robert Bourassa type Liberal in the disguise of a progressive Conservative. His entire agenda was a Liberal agenda, but because he was coming from Quebec, and we've had the Liberal government until Pierre-Elliott Trudeau stepped down, there was a flip over, and then we had another hiatus with Stephen Harper, but it's been a liberal run in a sense, So we made the transition. We went under the American umbrella, but then something else has evolved after 1991. Which is the American empire, the globalism, the liberal-based order, rule-based order. And in that context, Canada has drifted, that is the ruling class, the Laurentian elite, the political parties that are the mouthpieces and organs of the Laurentian elite, both the Liberal, the Conservative, and the NDP in effect. And we can throw in the Green and all of these others. They're all within that consensus of the Laurentian elite, that we have now drifted even further in terms of that globalism, that is post-1991, end of the Cold War, and a new arrangement that has taken place at the World Economic Forum, Davos, and so on and so forth, EU. And the seeds of it was laid under Pierre-Elliott Trudeau in the 1970s when Canada opted. The third option was that instead of being closely allied openly, and you mentioned that we refused to participate in any way, form, or shape during the long 12 years or 14 years of the Vietnam War. And all of that consequence, we stayed away from it. We did not participate in it. In fact, we became a haven for American draft dodgers and those Americans who left instead of joining and being drafted to fight in Vietnam. So we became a haven for them. We moved on, that is the ruling class moved on to becoming where the ruling classes arrived at. That is, I would define them as you have just quoted Justin Trudeau, no core values, post-nation state. It is a ruling class that has no core values. It is a ruling class that is calling itself post-nation state, which is what is the Davos man. They are the ruthless cosmopolitan. Samuel Huntington, who wrote the famous book Clash of Civilization in the early 1990s, also subsequently wrote about this phenomena called the Davos man, and he described the Davos man. And the Davos man is a man who sees himself as a cosmopolitan. So that's the term ruthless cosmopolitan comes about.
A citizen of the world.
Himself,
a citizen of the world.
Citizen of the world. He wants to be part of the economic super elite, who may carry a passport of the United States or Canada or multiple passports. It doesn't matter, but they belong to that super elite class. They identify with the super elite. They are the homo economicus, their cultural value, their religious value, the traditional value, their identity is no longer connected with the boundaries of the nation state, and that's where we arrive. And to them, the people of the nation state are the deplorables, in the words of Hillary Clinton. So you and I and all of us who cling, as Obama said, cling to religion or guns or whatever it is that makes us a nation state in terms of our tradition, our history, and our loyalties. We are simply deplorables, and so on. And so they are making the decision. And so it is that transition that has taken place. So in that context, we have no foreign policy doctrine. We have a doctrine which is not for the people, but which is for the ruling class. Just as Mr. Biden said, oh my God, this man has to go in Warsaw, or as Lloyd Austin says, we're going to reduce Russia basically to nothing that they can do to impede our agenda, which is a liberal rule-based order. There you have it. So this is the proxy war. If you're not going to agree with us, we're going to bring about a regime change, a color revolution, and we're going to push that happen. And the media, which is the propaganda arm, their instrument by which they preach, they convert, and they message. If you question the narrative of the media, then you are a member of the deplorable class, and you have to be canceled. Whether it is now on the question of Ukraine and Putin, whether he's a good guy, bad guy, whether he had any justification or not, that history you and I have discussed previously. If you question the narrative of New York Times, Washington Post, NBC, and so on, CBC, BBC, then you are a Putin's man. You need to be canceled. Or if you question, transgenderism or LGBTQ, or a man can be a woman and can be pregnant, a question that was asked only this week in the US Senate by a Republican senator, I forget his name, on this crisis, manufactured crisis that has come about with Roe versus Wade in American politics, the leaking of the Supreme Court justices' draft on the decision, majority decision regarding Roe versus Wade. A question was asked by the senator to this panel of women opponents of what they expect will be the overturning of the Roe versus Wade. And the question was a very simple question: do men get pregnant? And with a very serious demeanor, the woman replied, who was being questioned, yes, men can become pregnant. And if you question that, then you are deplorable. You are part of the people deserve to be canceled out. So this is where we have arrived. They have no explanation. We have overturned all history. the Americans can define now who are the good guys and the bad guys without any reference to history. And so in Ukraine, we are arming, as per the American demand, which the Americans, we are arming the Nazis, the real Nazis, not fake Nazis. We are arming the real Nazis. We have armed the real Nazis. We have contributed to them. We have sent our men in disguise into Ukraine before the shooting started. We didn't pull them out. People are not being told what is happening. We now know the senior NATO officers have been brought out of Azov Steel in Mariupol, which has fallen to the Russian forces on the Donbass region. And Azov Steel, a huge complex, people who were in there, the Azov battalion, the Ukrainian forces, along with a number of foreign mercenaries, including Canadian, and some senior officers from NATO countries, have been rounded up and are now being held in custody, according to what we are hearing, but not through the mainstream media. It is coming through European sources or through Russian sources for instance, a 3-star general, Canadian Lieutenant General Trevor John Cadu, has been picked up, is now being held as a prisoner of war. There is a U.S. Admiral, if I think I have his name, yes, U.S. Admiral Eric Thor Olson, a U.S. Lieutenant General Roger Cloutier, a British Colonel, Lieutenant Colonel John Bailey, number of other NATO officers whose names have not been released yet. Their suspicion of them are French and Poles. So what have they been doing there? They're belligerent. They have dragged their country into a war against Russia in support of a country that is infested with the Nazis who we fought under Prime Minister Mackenzie King in the Second World War at an immense cost. The rest of the world fought to defeat the Nazis. And here, our Deputy Prime Minister, the British Prime Minister, the American President, they're all lined up to support how brave and courageous these defenders are for the independence of Ukraine, completely whitewashing their history, both past and present. So we are left to wonder what sort of a nation state, independent sovereign state we are. We sent 338 members to the parliament to represent us, the people, Canadians, from coast to coast to coast. And there is a pin drop silence on the fundamental questions, which at least, whether we agreed with or we disagreed with, there were those Canadians of French background in World War I and World War II and Boer War. They said, no, this is not our war. We are not going to fight it. We are not going to join. And they had their representative in the parliament. They questioned it. That was their right. The government had to have an answer. And the answer was, at least during World War II, the famous answer of Prime Minister King. There would be conscription if necessary, but not necessarily conscription. In other words, Prime Minister Mackenzie King was not going to, impose conscription on the French population of Quebec.
Sounds like a perfect politician straddling the fence.
Perfect politician straddling the fence, or the perfect guy who understood the dilemma of the nation state or the country that we are. That you don't break it up if there are these fragile points, in the body politics of the country. How do you keep it together? And the biggest stress that the country faces is the stress in a situation of war or going into war, you know. Of course, now the biggest stress alongside a physical war is the question of pandemics. Bioweapons have become now an instrument of war. I mean, if you take the whole spectrum of war, there is information war, there is the actual, shooting war, and that involves all the entire spectrum of information, disinformation, image making, satellites, and so on and so forth, to now the bioweapons. And we saw the effects of the bioweapons coming out of Wuhan lab in China with COVID-19. And the Russians have disclosed that somewhere close to 30 biolabs were being funded by the Americans in Ukraine. That Ukraine was, in an effect, a launching pad of bioweapons, apart from other weapons that Ukraine was being made into a launching pad. Launching pad against whom? Against Russia. So
perhaps even against Canadians.
Precisely.
Or Americans. Like, we cannot trust these people anymore. I mean, would anybody trust a Joe Biden? Would anybody trust a Jagmeet Singh or a Justin Trudeau? No, of course not. These people are psychopathic killers. And so when they discover these illegal bioweapon gain-of-function labs in Ukraine, then you have to hold up your hands and say, just hold on a minute here. Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? Maybe Justin Trudeau is right in a sense, unfortunately, that we are a post-national nation, post-national state, that we are not a country anymore, and that we are run by Davos man. And it does not look very good for us, as Canadians anymore. I've taken down my Canadian flag in my driveway a few months ago, because it represents to me something that I can no longer, like you say, have allegiance to. Not the people. A lot of the people, of course, family, friends, but the government. It's not my government. He's not my prime minister.
Right. To the extent that we have still the privilege and the freedom to say so, you're right.
Do we?
But if the way we have moved, I mean, what happened in just a few months ago in Canada with the Freedom Convoy, the truckers, these were people like yourself, myself, our friends, common Canadian, trying to basically assert their fundamental rights, whether they will put on the mask, whether they will allow themselves to be vaccinated and then boosted with more vaccine, whether they can freely move in their own country or travel abroad. What we took as granted was no longer there, and therefore the Freedom Truckers convoy came to Ottawa, and the Prime Minister, with no core values in a post-national state, did what Hillary Clinton did in 2016. Hillary Clinton called the voters for Trump the deplorables. The Prime Minister of Canada called the Freedom Convoy and those who support the terrorists, and brought down
hold intolerable views. And do we tolerate these people?
So in effect, the nation states are becoming, or have already become, particularly in the West. Take the case of New Zealand, take the case of Australia. The intensity of the mandates and the closure that was put upon those people in Australia, in New Zealand. And then, of course, in Canada, here we have it, and to some extent in America, but America is divided between blue and red states. So there was that space in between. But in the Anglosphere. You had it in Britain, you had it in Canada, New Zealand, Australia. What we are seeing, these are supposed to be quote unquote the advanced countries of the world. We have walked around the world, our prime ministers and our leaders, elected leaders and our intellectuals have walked around in the world, waving our Anglo-American flag as the bastion of freedom. We never examined them. We took it as granted, and so we never explored them. But when the rubber hit the road in this period after 1991-92, with the end of the Cold War, as unknown to the general population, the country was moved by the leadership, the ruling class, the 1% of the Davos man. What we find is they are no longer representing the people, and the nation state, which is their platform of operation as ruthless cosmopolitans, as the global citizen, but they need to have a platform from where they can become the global citizen. So a Canadian, platform. These platforms, which are the nation states, have been turned into gulags. We might be very comfortable gulags, but we are gulags. And nobody is asking that question. So unless the people begin to assert their right to ask this question, and then the logical consequence of asking this question is to lead to making decision which sort of political parties and leaders they're going to support in their election. When it happens, we will have this continuing conundrum that the people, and we're having an election right here in Ontario, the people will vote for the same group of the ruthless cosmopolitans who brought them into the situation where their fundamental rights were nullified, will vote for them again.
It seems so, polls suggest, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there might be a sprinkle of votes here and there, and you and I, we participated in it, and we went through it. Everything that we have talked about and are talking about is not something entirely new in the sense of it's a eureka moment. We've been talking about this for the last so many years. And in particular, you and I together talked about this in London in the 2019 campaign. Yeah, almost everything that we are saying, we predicted it. And yet, we saw the result, not once, but twice. 2019, 2021, and I bet it will happen again.
Yeah, this seems to be a conversation that will have no end because we're not talking to the right people. We're talking to people of like mind, but we're not talking to the Davos man. We're not talking to Trudeau and Singh and Biden and Johnson. We're talking amongst ourselves in this video. So it's a rhetorical question that we say, can Canada have a proper national defense policy, a proper foreign policy? But it's an open question. It will not be answered, at least I don't think answered anytime soon. So why don't we leave it there as a point of discussion to perhaps continue on at another time, Salim.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your input, always great.
Thank you very much.